Kaiser.com.
Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. Time now to go to San Francisco and speak to Richard Heinberg of the Post-Carbon Institute. Richard is the author of several books, including The Party's Over, Blackout, Peak Everything, which I happen to have read myself and found to be extremely interesting, and his new book, The End of Growth. Richard Heinberg, welcome to the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Good to be with you.
All right, Richard Heinberg, your latest book is called The End of Growth. Tell us about it.
Well, the book, unfortunately, is not out yet, but it makes the controversial claim that world economic growth has hit non-negotiable limits as of 2008, and that we're in a new economic era. It's not a recession that will end at some point and we'll get back to normal growth. Rather, we have seen the end of economic growth as we know it. In fact, this shouldn't be a big surprise. The best-selling environmental book of all time back in 1972 was called Limits to Growth, and it forecast that sometime in the early 21st century, resource depletion and population growth would lead us into a cul-de-sac such that world economic growth would cease. I believe we're at that point, and it's largely because of oil prices, which essentially are forming a cap on economic growth. If the economy starts to recover, that pushes oil prices up, and when oil prices go up, they undercut economic activity. So all the cheap, easy oil is gone. It's not that we're about to run out of oil, but the price of extraction and exploration is rising rapidly. So at this point, I believe energy prices are effectively capping economic growth.
Okay, so going back a ways, early years of the London School of Economics, there was Thomas Malthus. He came up with the Malthusian Dyer prediction, which set the stage, as a matter of fact, for the entire field of economics being referred to as the dismal science, in that there would be, of course, arithmetic growth of resources versus geometric growth of the population, that we'd run out of resources, the economy would come crashing to a halt. But what he didn't count on is innovation, technology, and everything we've seen since that time. Why is this time different?
Well, right. The biggest thing that Thomas Malthus missed was the fossil fuel era. He had no way of knowing that there would be enormous amounts of cheap energy available to fuel economic growth and also to fuel industrial agriculture, which nobody dreamed of in Malthus's time. Even as recently as the 1980s and 1990s, there was a strong argument that resources would not get more expensive because of innovation, as you say. We would just get better at extracting lower and lower grades of resources. Well, since 2000, the situation has turned around. They were just making the bet too early, and I think Malthus was essentially saying what he said too early as well. He said that there would be limits to food supplies if population keeps growing. I think he's absolutely right. We're seeing food prices going through the roof right now, as well as energy prices. These limits are elastic to a certain extent. We can push them out with efficiency, with energy efficiency, with more global trade, by using more energy to extract lower grade resources and so on. But there are limits to all of those strategies, and I think we're reaching those limits as well.
All right, let me ask you a question. I heard something recently. I want your comment on it. It has to do with the amount of debt that's in the global economy. And the hypothesis is as follows. To pay off this debt requires a certain amount of growth. And, of course, in our modern 21st century world, growth means oil, oil-driven growth. And the commentator that I read was suggesting that the amount of growth it would take to generate the ability to pay off this debt versus the amount of oil in the ground that could be burned to engineer that growth does not exist. In other words, we have more debt than we have oil to burn to finance the retirement of that debt. Are you familiar with that equation? And if so, could you comment on it?
Well, I think that's probably true. But the point is really that we've created all of this debt to fund economic growth. We have even created modern currency as a form of debt. We loan money into existence. So without increasing levels of debt, we have no way to increase the money supply to fund economic growth. Now, this seemed to make sense in decades past when we had lots of cheap energy with which to make the economy grow. But as energy resources get more scarce and expensive, not only oil, but coal as well, as that happens, then we end up with this huge debt overhang. There's no way that those debts can ultimately be paid off. And this is effectively what happened in 2008. We had the bursting of a housing bubble. House prices couldn't keep increasing forever. But also in 2008, we had the oil price spike up to almost $150 a barrel. And those two things together, the bursting of the housing bubble and the oil price spike, sent the economy into a tailspin. We remember the housing bubble, but most people forget about the oil price spike. But they're not going to forget for long because the same thing's happening this year again.
All right, tell us about the Goldilocks syndrome, as you call it, your thoughts on how markets may respond to this resource scarcity.
The Goldilocks syndrome is a term actually invented by a New York Times writer. I didn't invent it, but I think it's a really good metaphor to use for the situation we're in, because we need oil prices to be within a certain narrow band in order for the economy to function. These days, to fund exploration and production, oil companies need prices in the range of at least $70 per barrel. That's because all the cheap, easy stuff is gone. We've used the low-hanging fruit principle of resource extraction for looking for oil. And we have gotten all of the low-hanging fruit.
Richard Heinberg, you're near San Francisco, north of San Francisco. You're in an area, of course, near Silicon Valley, which is the home of entrepreneurialism and venture capital and social networking sites and Apple Computer and all these whiz-bang, shiny, glossy little products coming off the assembly line. And it seems, tell us about what's happening on the ground there in San Francisco. Is there an awareness of this peak everything phenomenon, or is there this blithe kind of belief that technology is going to save the day? Is there a comprehension there in San Francisco, or is everyone just going to continue to play the venture capital game?
I think if you took a poll of the general population here in Northern California, you'd get a strong majority of people believing that innovation can continue to solve our problems in perpetuity, and we don't really face any fundamental resource limits. But as I say, that is changing. As oil prices go up, as food prices go up, people start to get worried. And I guess their worry is that innovation can't keep up, and we're not investing in it enough. But I would go further. I would say that there are basic limits to what we can accomplish with efficiency, substitution, and innovation. We're hitting those. I think not many people would agree with that yet.
Now, I've seen a phrase being bandied about on the various financial websites a lot. It's the phrase buyflation, which is different than stagflation. Buyflation is commodity prices rising while wages are deteriorating. Do you buy into this phrase, and what does this phrase mean, if you have a comment on that?
Well, I think that is what we are seeing and what we are going to see. And I think not many financial commentators really understand what's behind it. Not many of them would agree that it's a result of fundamental scarcity. That, as I've said earlier, we've reached the low-hanging fruit. We've already picked the low-hanging fruit in terms of oil, coal, natural gas, minerals, fresh water, fish, forests, et cetera, et cetera. And so as time goes on, we're inevitably having to expend more effort to harvest resources, and that effort is energy. So if energy itself is also becoming more scarce, then we get into this cul-de-sac. And therefore, even if we can raise wages with inflation, prices of basic resources are going to rise faster than wages. Right.
So unlike the periods of inflation in the past, or even the stagflation of the 1970s, you did have, of course, there was a lot more union representation at that time. You did have wages at least keeping up to some degree with what was happening on the inflation front. Okay, so let's look forward a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. What does a post-carbon economy look like?
Well, it looks smaller than the economy we see around us today, and it's also more localized because globalization is based on cheap transport fuel. So as transport fuel gets more expensive, that changes the equations with regard to comparative advantage and globalization. So we will see more production regionally. Now, it doesn't mean that global trade will go away overnight or altogether at any point, but it is going to shift. Also, we're going to need to become more generalists rather than being more and more highly specialized. More and more of us are going to have to know how to grow food, how to take care of ourselves in terms of health care and so on. And so that's really going to change what daily life looks like. It's not just going to be a matter of hopping in the car and rushing over to the other side of town to buy a new flat screen TV. We're going to be more concerned about providing basic necessities for ourselves. A good pair of new shoes, for example, is going to be a much bigger deal for us in 5 or 10 years than it has been.
Okay, well, that's the book is coming out in hopefully in a couple of months. It's
right.
Called The End of Growth. It's a follow-up to Blackout and Peak Everything, which basically is exactly what it says. It's about all various natural resources. We're now in the end game as the neoliberal industrial model has eaten up all of the cheap availability of these resources. So I would look forward to seeing when the book comes out, The End of Growth. Richard Heinberg, thanks so much for being on the Kaiser Report.
It's been great talking with you, Max. Thanks.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Richard Heinberg. If you want to send me an email, please do so at kaiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, this is Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.